Well, there is no doubt this is one of the more difficult portions in our Torah that we study. First of all, it's difficult because it's so foreign to us. It's more foreign to us in the 21st century than it might have been if we were studying this in the 19th century or 18th century. But it is foreign to us, and it is because it comes across as something that simply could not take place with any reality. In fact, many of the liberal scholars point to this passage, which is referred to as sota meaning bitter waters, and it's spelled two different ways, as we'll see. But at any rate, they say, see, this proves that the Hebrew Bible is just filled with all kinds of hocus pocus stuff that isn't real. In fact, if you do research, and I'm sure some of you have, I know have, is there any sense at all that there could be a medical reality to drinking water that has dust in it, that has ink that has been, washed off into it, that it could cause what this text says it will cause if the wife is guilty? The answer is no. There's nothing that in our world we could experiment with to say this would cause. So bear with me as we go through this. I don't have all the answers, that's for sure. And when you read the commentators, most of them say we don't have any of the answers on this. The rabbis tried to make sense of it. And this is why in the more ancient history, they put the Haftarah from Hosea 4. Because it seems so lopsided in the Torah, but then when you read the Haftarah, Hosea, it's not just the wife who was guilty, it was the husband who was just as guilty. And the other thing we should remember is that in the ancient Near East particularly, there were plenty of pagan religions, most of which had a fertility cult. In fact, Plato, in his, believe it's in the Republic, I can't remember, but yes, I think it's so. Plato makes the statement, and I'm paraphrasing, that it is the good political and national duty of every father to give his daughters to the temple for at least 1 year. In other words, they believed that the act of fertility was what pleased the gods and goddesses, and would therefore bring good fortune for the nation. So, this kind of thing became in the society something very common. It didn't make it right by any means. But what happens, what does the enemy do? The enemy takes something that God hates and makes it common, so that the conscience of people are put to sleep with regard to it. It's a worldly anesthesia. It's like if it's everyone does it, and then if the government says this is what a good citizen would do, because if you engage in this kind of activity, then you will help the nation as a whole be prosperous. You will be prosperous, your family will be prosperous, the gods and goddesses will bless us if you will do this. And everyone does it. What do you suppose that would do to the whole idea of marriage in the home? Any wonder that in ancient Rome, pedophilia became its primary downfall. And I'm not being explicit because we have young people here, but in fact, some historians say that the reason that the Roman Empire fell was because they could not put forward a fighting force of men. Because so many of the young boys had been misused. It was decadency gone mad and acceptable. It's the same thing we have, to a certain extent, going on in our own country with regard, for instance, to abortion. The people that are against one social ill inevitably are against, many of them inevitably are against abortion. Why? Now, please, as we talk through this, this is a difficult passage. I don't think there's probably a family represented here that doesn't have some, in the past or whenever, breakdown of the family, right? Years ago when I started doing my family as well as Paulette's, right? I mean, we live in a fallen world. So I don't want anyone to think that if something like this has occurred in your past, or if you are experiencing the breakup of family and so forth and so on, through the sinful actions of some, I don't want you to think at all that the Scriptures are saying that therefore you're outcast. No. There is always repentance and always forgiveness in God's family. God is waiting and ready for those who have erred and fallen into sin to turn from their sin and to come to Him for forgiveness. And He said, anyone who comes to me, I will most certainly not send them away. Right? So even though we're touching on very sensitive subjects here, we're not pointing fingers. We're asking ourselves, where does this affect me? And what is the positive message? And I can say that right off at the beginning. The positive message is this: relationships are fragile. Don't ever think that relationships are just, well, rock solid and it won't matter what I do. No. You know, some of the most expensive and highly sought after glass crystal are those which are made from the thinnest possible. They are the most delicate. Sometimes relationships that we have are more delicate than we know. God intends us to strengthen our relationships through honestly living as He intends, following the Scriptures as they speak. And what do the Scriptures constantly tell us in terms of building the kind of relationships, and I'm thinking more specifically about between a husband and a wife within the family? What is it that constantly characterizes a right relationship? It is the willingness first to give up myself. Right? I mean, all of our difficulties in relationship are usually when I feel like I've not been properly befriended. My needs are not properly met. I'm being taken for granted. Well, how did our apostolic portion read? At the end it said, so husbands, love your wife as the Messiah loved His wife, His ecclesia, right? His people, and let the wife reverence her husband. What does it mean to love as the Messiah loved? It means to give oneself, to put oneself in a secondary position, and to look at the needs of the other as more important than your own needs. It's amazing, isn't it? We've all experienced this, I know, time and time again. When we do that, we find out that the needs that we have are oftentimes met in ways we never knew. So that's the big picture of this very difficult section. God considers marriage to be extremely important and extremely valuable. And therefore it must be guarded, because anything that is valuable to God is hated by the enemy. And the enemy will do all that he can to disrupt what God loves. According to our apostolic portion, why did God give marriage in the first place? You know, you don't find marriage in the natural world, do you? If you just go to a society where the Bible has not been well founded, what do you oftentimes find? Polygamy, polyandry. There's even tribals, even today, there's tribes in Africa that basically swap every year their husbands and wives. Yeah, it's a one-year thing. We shake our heads saying, is that possible? Yes, it is possible. Why? Because there's nothing in nature that teaches you about marriage. At least not God's marriage. Right? You look at the animal kingdom, some will say, well, there are some animals that are monogamous and, so forth and so on. Okay, that's true. But there's plenty that aren't, right? There's one male with many females in the animal world. The only place that you find out what God wants about marriage is in the Bible. And it starts at the very beginning. Right? He says, it's not good for man to be alone. Sorry, guys. We can't handle it. We can't do it on our own. God didn't make us to be independent. Is that why as men we admitting our weaknesses? Our needs? Asking for help? Going to the doctor? I don't know, whatever it may be. Well, so the primary message of this section, I think, is that God considers the bond between a husband and a wife to be of extreme importance because it is the one best illustration that he has given to us of how he loves us and how we are to love him. So when the marriage isn't doing what it should do, it's not portraying what God intends it to portray. So this is the section that has the laws of sota, taken from the word to go astray, sometimes spelled with a sin, sometimes spelled with a samic. If any man's wife goes astray, sota. This word is used elsewhere in the Tanakh only of harlotry. It's found in our portion. It's found in Proverbs 4:15 and 7:25. The Mishnah has a full tractate by the same name in which the sages attempt to decipher and explain the laws of this unusual ritual. Of course, the sages take the whole matter much further in this tractate, extending the discussion to matters relating to the eating of the wave offering, the issue of a priest's daughter thought to have engaged in unlawful sexual relations, and a host of related subjects. But it is clear from studying this Mishnaic tractate that this Parashah and the ritual it describes presented plenty of questions to the sages, and they never liked to leave a question unanswered. So instead of saying, we don't know, of course, they came up with all kinds of explanations. Perhaps the most obvious question is why the Torah offers a husband the means of dealing with a wife suspected of unfaithfulness, but is silent about what a wife is to do who suspects her husband has been unfaithful. Current feminist interpretations mark this as yet another proof that early Israelite society was essentially misogynist. You know the word misogynist? Misogyny? Okay. Comes from the two Greek words to hate and the word for woman. Treating women as property without individual rights. While it is true that ancient Near Eastern society in general often treated women as inferior to men and afforded them far less protection within the framework of society, it is unfair to characterize the Torah as equally misogynist. The Torah does legislate protection for women. Yet this hardly answers the question of why the Torah does not offer legal means for a wife who suspects her husband of being unfaithful to her. Interestingly, later rabbinic interpretation held that if the husband had been unfaithful, the ritual of sota would be ineffective in determining the actions of his wife. This is why Hosea was linked with our Torah portion. He says, I'm not going to punish the women for being unfaithful. The husbands are unfaithful. This is why they came up with the idea that if the husband himself were unfaithful, the whole ceremony wouldn't work. The whole thing wouldn't work. Now, that's one explanation. We should also note that Yeshua spoke of a situation where a woman divorces her husband. indicating that the legal system in his day did provide some recourse for women and that he applied the same criteria to both husband and wife in the matter. If Yeshua did that, that means the Torah does that, because Yeshua would never speak contrary to the Torah. So what we have here probably is a ceremony that is detailed with the idea that it might help a husband get over his jealousy, and it might help maintain the marriage. On the other hand, I've often wondered, as I've read this passage over and over again and studied it before, when the woman is found to be without guilt, can you imagine their conversation on the way home? It's like, really? I mean, how would you do this? The only way it would work is if the husband totally humbled himself and said, I've been a fool, I've been selfish, I have thought of things I should have never thought. Instead of coming to you when I should have, I didn't. I don't deserve your love, but if you're willing to give it to me, I so much want it. If there were that kind of an approach, there might be a means of saving the relationship. And it would take a woman of true character to forgive and to love. Yeah, an Abigail, yeah. Okay. The situation described in the ritual of Sota is when a husband has some evidence that his wife has acted unfaithfully with another man, but where no witnesses are available to confirm that she committed adultery. The text clearly says that she's being accused by her husband of committing adultery. If such witnesses were available, the penalty would be death both for the woman and her companion, right? The matter of jealousy arises when a husband warns his wife not to foster friendship with a certain man, yet she does, or he knows that she has been in a private place with another man. Now that's how it's understood by the sages, but I think they have some wisdom there. And men, let's be honest with ourselves. We who are married, we should make it a policy never to be alone with another woman than our wife. And you say, well, Tim, what do you think I'm going to do? You really think that of me? No, I don't. But the problem is the enemy is very smart. And if we are alone in a closed room with another woman in her house or something like that, and someone says, oh, I think that I knew what was going on, you have no way of proving it otherwise. So we make it a policy to always bring our wife along or have another man with us if we're going to help some single lady and so forth and so on, so that the enemy can have no advantage. Yeah, the vice president, our current vice president, basically, and so yeah, we can't say much for other presidents and what they did in their Oval Office, even though they denied it. Well, again, what does God want? He desires purity amongst us. That's the primary purpose of this passage. Well, in such a case, the husband must express his jealousy before two witnesses and bring his wife to the priest for the ritual of Sota. When he does, he must bring an offering of 1/10 ephah of barley grain as an offering for her, but the offering is not mixed with oil and frankincense as it would normally be the case, as in Leviticus 2, since these elements symbolize consecration and joy, while this offering is given as a symbol of jealousy for his wife and a memorial, a way of bringing to memory what was a reality. From the husband's viewpoint, his wife has been unfaithful to him. Literally, she has acted unfaithfully against him by an unfaithful act. The verb ma'al is used elsewhere only in relationship to God, to be unfaithful to God. But since the covenant relationship between Israel and God is regularly cast in the metaphor of marriage, its use here is understood in the same way that Israel is charged by the prophets with acting unfaithfully to God, which is what our Haftarah said, right? So the wife is accused by her husband, in this case, of acting unfaithfully in regard to their marriage covenant. The text is clear that the charge against the wife relates to adulterous intercourse. So it is a most serious charge, yet one that could not be proven by the necessary 2 or 3 eyewitnesses. If the charge is proven, then it is clear that the wife has defiled herself. But this is not merely ritual defilement, which could occur even in legitimate marital relations. The defilement in this case is one that pertains to sexual abominations that defile the land, a defilement that has enveloped the soul in rebellion against Hashem. Let's talk about the ritual itself. It consists of the priest putting holy water, which would be water from the laver, that the priest would wash, right? Why is it holy? Because it is to symbolize their holiness as they approach the altar. It has nothing to do with Roman Catholicism. Okay? It has nothing to do with a prayer said over a pot of water or something like that. It's that water which was pertained to the holiness of the priest as he did his duties within the tabernacle or temple. It consists of priests putting holy water into a clay vessel into which he mixes some dust from the floor of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. He then now, could it be done when the temple was standing? Was there dust on the temple floor? It may have been, or though they may have cleaned it regularly, who knows? He then requires the woman to let her hair go loose, literally to let free the head of the woman, meaning let her hair flow down freely, which I think helps us understand 1 Corinthians 11. And we can talk about and she will be able to conceive children, literally to retain seed. This final notice would indicate that if the woman is guilty, she would remain barren, unable to have children. Thus, her punishment was entirely from the hand of God and not administered by human judges. In fact, I don't think there's anything related to the actual medical or, shall we say, physical substance that she drinks that causes the problem. It has to be a miracle. It has to be God doing his work.
You know, the thought occurred to me, Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah, Ananias and Sapphira.
They died and then they dropped dead.
Yeah, right. And God took their lives, right, yeah. In this latter case, the rabbis ruled that the husband would be required to divorce his guilty wife, but since no witnesses of her guilt were available, she could not be executed. No, I don't agree with that. I don't think the husband was required at all to do that if she was found innocent. In a similar fashion, the sages ruled that if before the woman drank the bitter water, she confessed her sin of unfaithfulness, she would be saved the ordeal of the bitter water, but her husband would likewise be required to give her a bill of divorcement. And again, I don't find anything in the scriptures that requires a bill of divorcement. The whole matter is presented under the presumption that the husband is innocent, and the sages read verse 31 this way: if the man is clear of sin, then the woman shall suffer her guilt. They interpret this final verse of our Parashah on the basis of Hosea 4:14, our Haftarah: I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes, so the people without understanding are ruined. The difficulty in ascertaining the innocence of the husband, however, became a quagmire for the judges of Israel, so much so that according to the later rabbinic materials, by the time of Yochanan ben Zakkai, which would have been in the late Second Temple period, the ordeal of the bitter waters was abolished, even though the temple still stood and the Sanhedrin was active. If this notice offers some historical reality, which I don't know if it does, I less and less trust the rabbinic literature to give me history. I think it gives me more what people wanted history to, how they wanted history to read, but there may be some historical value. It may highlight that in the first century, the wayward activity of husbands within the Jewish community was common, and we have some fairly good indication of that. Yeshua's teaching that lust in the heart is the first seed of adultery was no doubt addressing the root problem. We face the same situation in our times, where the divorce rate among professing believers, this I'm talking about in the United States, not outside of the United States, exceeds that of the world. Now, I have to explain that, okay? When they were doing a survey of this years ago, and I don't know how many years ago, I think I got this statistic maybe 15 years ago, they were asking people this kind of question in an anonymous survey. Do you attend church? If so, or do you attend a religious meeting? If so, how often? And do you consider yourself an adherent of the religion of this that you visit? And then they ask, have you had sex outside of marriage? The majority of the people who answered the survey said that they were either Christians or they were Jewish, that they attended at least once a month, that they believed there was a God, that they believed that there was a Bible, so forth and so on. And it was over 50% said, and yes, they had had sex outside of marriage. So that's where I'm taking that statistic. There's absolutely no way, and I'm sorry, this is not an upper, is it? It's kind of a downer. But there's rejoicing at the end of this for sure. How could the pornographic industry be a multi-billion-dollar industry and not have an effect upon the society in which we live? To think that it doesn't have an effect is naive. And men, that is particularly directed towards us, isn't it? Primarily, not entirely, but primarily. If we give our affections in sight, in emotion, to anyone other than our wife, or if we're a single man, if we simply say, I refuse to accept that that is proper, I save myself for a possible future wife. If we have something other than that, we are giving into a culture that will change us. Don't think that we can dabble in the things that God hates and it not have an effect upon our life. It will, and it does. So we must say no, and we must be firm in it. And we must help others who have become entrenched in pornography and other things to be released from that emotional addiction. Right, everything, let me repeat that. We're becoming so visual. Things, the internet has made us very visual, and we don't even like to read anymore. We'd rather have icons. We'd rather just have pictures to show us what to do and how to do it. We're very visually oriented, and it certainly lends itself to a weakness to the visual side of things if we are not careful. Well, obviously, the implementation of Sota ritual is not existent in our time, for the temple is destroyed and the priesthood is non-functioning. So you say, well, we could never do this. You're right, we cannot. But we still ask our question, what are the enduring principles that we may glean from this Parashah which may be applied to our own lives today? Clearly, God's wisdom is contained in a portion like this, and it behooves us to discern this wisdom and apply it to ourselves. The issue of jealousy is one that cannot be sidestepped. If a husband or a wife believes that their spouse has acted unfaithfully, this situation must be confronted and a resolution sought. Trying to sweep it under the carpet only assures a breakdown of the relationship. When considered as a whole, the Sota ritual allowed the husband to voice his jealousy and to deal with it by either proving his wife's unfaithfulness or exonerating her. But could the relationship between the husband and wife be destroyed if she is exonerated? Such would be possible only if both the husband and wife were willing both to give and receive forgiveness from each other and to commit themselves to rebuilding a relationship based upon genuine love as God defines it. I am convinced, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the spiritual ability to forgive is at the core of a marriage that can last. Unfortunately, in our day and age, in our modern society, we have this romantic view of marriage. I mean, I've been astounded when I've talked with people that I've met, and some which I know more personally, how much money they have spent on their wedding. We're talking $10,000, $15,000 or more. Yeah, or more. Double that. Yeah. Why? It's an emotional kind of an approach to the whole idea of marriage. Now, I'm all for marriage and I'm all for celebration of it. But oftentimes people come into marriage with eyes that are a bit clouded from what it really takes to make a marriage work. If anyone thinks that you're going to marry the perfect person, you had better stop. We are all sinners, even those of us that are sinners saved by grace. And it will be required to forgive one another and to do it on a regular basis with reality and truth in order to maintain a relationship that honors God. And that's true for all relationships, but it's maybe specifically and particularly true in marriage. Yeah, and this is why the statement's being made that counseling for couples before getting married is a requirement. I know it is for me if I'm going to officiate in a ceremony of marriage, which is one of the high points in my responsibilities. I love that. But I want to make sure that I've had some time to talk with the couple. There was something there that had reality when they were telling us this is what will make it work. And it wasn't all deep theology. My father, one thing he told me, he said, Tim, when you're married, if you take it out of the shelf, put it back in the shelf. If you take it off, if you take your socks off, put them where they're supposed to go. Don't leave the towel on the floor in the bathroom. Really, he went through a list of things. And I thought, well, that's good advice, because my roommate and I, in college, before I was married, in the dorm room, Ron and I, we were typical guys, right? You know, once a week we'd clean it up. The rest of the time it doesn't matter, right? And I still remember Paulette saying to one of her friends when we had been married maybe for, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and we were together with another couple that were friends of ours. I heard her say to the other gal, she goes, I can't believe it. He picks up after himself like you wouldn't believe. Okay. Yeah. Mark 1, okay. So sometimes it's just the little things. But what are those little things? They are the indication that you care about the other person, because why should they have to do the work that you should be doing? Right? It's just being considerate. All right, but let's go on. But what if the wife were proven guilty? What recourse did the husband have in such a case? The sages point to Deuteronomy 24 as giving the answer. Here the husband has found an indecent matter, an ervat davar in his wife, but apparently not one that could be proven via eyewitnesses. In such a case, he's allowed to give his wife a bill of divorcement. Is this talking about a wife who was found guilty by the ritual of sota? Some of the sages thought so. In the broad scope of things, the sota ritual allowed the dissolution of a marriage where sexual unfaithfulness was proven in spite of the lack of witnesses. When Yeshua was confronted with the meaning of Deuteronomy 24 in Matthew 19, remember Deuteronomy 24 is talking about giving her a bill of divorcement and sending her away. It is apparent that the teachers of his day had expanded the application of this text far beyond its original meaning. Yeshua brings it back to the matter of sexual unfaithfulness within a marriage. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. In so doing, he adhered to the interpretation of Deuteronomy 24 in light of the sota passage of our Parashah. In other words, you can't just say, okay, I think she's done something wrong, I'm divorcing her. No. Unless immorality can be proven, there's no cause for divorce as far as Yeshua is concerned. There are obviously many other, by the way, as an aside, the Matthew 19 also makes it clear that Yeshua says polygamy is not God's way. Years ago, we had someone who, his wife divorced him, and then she realized she'd done wrong and wanted back. And he said, okay. And we counseled them not to get together right away and to spend some time kind of talking with each other, with counselor and so forth and so on. They didn't do that. They got right back together. He kicked her out of the house, said, as far as we're concerned, you're divorced. We're divorced because you have the paper. You did it, not me. And so then when he wanted to marry another gal and came and asked if we would sanction that marriage, we said no. As far as God is concerned, you're still married. There wasn't immorality that caused this divorce. You need to work on getting back together. And he said, well, I can have 2 wives. Yeah. I said, no. Matthew 19:9 says, if you divorce your wife and marry someone else, you committed adultery. So, wait a minute. Is there a biblical sanction for divorce? For known, provable immorality, yes. Other than that, it's adultery. So you can't be, if you divorce, if someone, but not on biblical terms as far as God's concerned, they're still married. Right? Just because they have a piece of paper from the judge doesn't mean anything in God's court. So if they're still married and they marry someone else, what is that? Adultery. Proving what? Polygamy. Now you say, well, what about David? What about, Jacob, so forth and so on. Well, every time you have polygamy in the Bible, it's problems. Every time. It never works out.
Isn't it true also that in the Torah the kings were not supposed to?
They were not to multiply their wives. The king it says very clear that the kings are not to multiply their wives, and that's exactly what Solomon did, and what did it do? It took his heart away from the Lord.